thought-provoking discussions, we're moving on to the closing keynote speech. It's our great honor to have the former President of Estonia, His Excellency Toomas Hendrik Ilves, with us. But before we bring him to you, I would like to invite Deputy Minister MOFA TIEN Chung-Kwang once again to introduce our speaker and topic. Please welcome Deputy Minister Tien once again to come up to the stage.
Dr. Mark Chang, the Chairman of Prospect Foundation, and Michael Shaw, Advisor to the President, invited dignitary from abroad, Excellencies, invited guests, friends online, good evening. It gives me a great pleasure to introduce the closing keynote speaker for the year's forum, His Excellency Toomas Hendrik Ilves, the former President of the Republic of Estonia. Mr. Ilves first visited Taiwan in 2018 to participate in the Digital Innovation Forum hosted by APAC Business Advisory Council. And 4 years later, it is our honor to welcome Mr. Ilves to the Taiwan to address our凱達格蘭 Forum. Mr. Ilves graduated from Columbia University before receiving his master's degree in psychology from the University of Pennsylvania in 1978. He moved back to Europe in 1984, working as a journalist, as foreign policy analyst. He then became the diplomat and served as ambassador to the United States, Canada, and Mexico from 1993 to 1996. He served in the government as Minister of Foreign Affairs from 1996 to 1998, and again from 1999 to 2002. Later, he was the member of European Parliament from 2004 to 2006. He was also the leader of Estonia's Social Democratic Party during the 1990s. And he was elected President of Estonia in 2006 and re-elected for the second term in 2011. During his 10 years presidency, he also served in the several high positions in the field of ICT of European Union, including chairman of the EU task force on the e-health and the chairman of the European Cloud Partnership Steering Board. He was also the chairman of the World Economic Forum Global Agenda Council on Cyber Security. Mr. Ilves' interest in all things digital began early, and under his leadership, Estonia made tremendous advances, becoming one of the most digitalized savvy nations in the world. Mr. Ilves introduced Estonia's e-presidency program and digitalized public services. He also defended Estonia against cyber attacks from Russia. I'm sure he would have a lot to share in this issue. In a prominent position on his personal website, he said, "I'm a liberal." That says nothing about whether I'm a left or right, but I believe in free and fair elections, rule of law, and respect for human rights. Mr. Ilves is indeed a staunch supporter and defender of such universal values as democracy, freedom, and human rights. We, the people of Taiwan, share the same values. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming His Excellency Toomas Hendrik Ilves. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for those kind words. And I am indeed thrilled to be back in Taiwan, a dynamic center of liberty and democracy. And I'd like to thank the organizers of the Katagalan Forum for inviting me. But before I begin, a word on terminology. We too often use a term that is no doubt odd, if not jarring here, the West, by which is meant those nations that are liberal democracies characterized by, as was just mentioned, free and fair elections, rule of law, respect for fundamental rights and freedoms, a tripartite separation of powers originally posited by Montesquieu in 1750. Using the term the West is partially historical, partially due to the fact that from a 20th century Eurocentric perspective, it was the East that was historically so often despotic and authoritarian, as was the West before the Enlightenment of the 18th century, and as first results, the American and French revolutions. This needs no explanation here in Taiwan, but does in the so-called West, and I urge you to repeat at all opportunities that liberal democracy and the West are not synonymous. Or you can alternatively define Taiwan as part of the West, which is one of the points of my talk today. So, to begin, I will talk about international politics and technology and how we parse these temporally and what it means for our future. When we think of our political, geopolitical security environments, which we rarely, if ever, recognize them until they are over. Pericles, or Plato for that matter, could hardly say that he lived in the pinnacle of the Hellenic age, just as Charlemagne or Eloise and Abelard would think of themselves as living in the Middle Ages. These are all post hoc terms invented afterwards when people were living in what was for them their own terra nova, the period afterward. Today, we're at the dawn of a new era of uncertainty in international affairs, felt most keenly in Taiwan and Ukraine, but should be understood by all of us in the West. We don't yet know what this era is, but we do know that what is now over. The post-war, meaning post-World War II era, characterized generally by an international consensus forged in the UN Charter of 1945, forbidding the use or threat of force to change borders. In other words, forbidding aggression. This applies to all members of the United Nations and ironically violated most brutally today by one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, Russia, with ominous threats emanating from a second permanent member, the People's Republic of China. The post-war era, characterized by unprecedented economic growth as well as the expansion of liberty and democracy across the globe, did not just happen. It was created once by and led by the US and those whom we have come to call its allies, through the establishment of a series of international institutions designed to prevent the recurrence of the conditions that plunged the world into that most horrific of conflagrations, the Second World War. Its ultima ratio was, of course, to prevent war itself, specifically interstate wars of aggression. In his not quite modestly titled Present at the creation, U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson, who in fact was present throughout much of its creation, described the efforts the U.S. undertook during and immediately after after World War II, when in essence it was the only country able to do so, creating in the short span of 6 years, 6 years from 1944 to 1950, the following still functioning institutions. One, the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank to lend money to countries that in need, the International Monetary Fund to stabilize currencies, and as well, the GATT, or the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which later became the WTO, or World Trade Organization. Secondly, as I mentioned, the United Nations Charter in 1945 with all the various organizations under the UN, but importantly, the Charter's prohibition of use of force to change borders. UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, which later subsumed under the UN to assist originally the 25 million refugees and displaced persons in Europe after World War II. The Marshall Plan, $184 billion in today's dollars from the United States to help rebuild post-war Europe. NATO, created in 1949 after communist coups d'etat in Eastern Europe against democratically elected governments. And finally, the Schuman Declaration in 1950, establishing the European Coal and Steel Community, which in 1956 became the European Economic Community, and in 1995, the European Union, with 19 of its 27 members using a common currency. The last one, of course, was originally created by Europeans, not the United States, though they were pretty happy this happened. My point is, when it was needed to act, fundamentally important institutions were created to preserve an international order of peace and a general expansion of the concept of liberty, and to defend the countries that, in fact, had opted for liberal democracy. Again, I want to stress all of the groundwork for what we call the post-war consensus or order was laid down in these 6 years. For perspective, it's useful to keep in mind that it has been 8 years since Russia invaded Ukraine, and we haven't really seen much action at all. The post-war order, we can actually divide into 2 periods, which we call today, for one, the Cold War, lasting from immediately after World War II until the period 1989-91, when in much of the world communism collapsed. And for lack of a better word, because we have nothing smarter to call it, the post-Cold War era, which began in 1989-91 with the final collapse of the USSR and lasted until February 24th of this year. Of course, some of us think it ended earlier, but that we can discuss. The Cold War, with the benefit of hindsight after 1991, was characterized by a constant fear of nuclear war with massive defense expenditures, where as late as the 1980s, even Germany hit 3% of GDP on defense expenditures. People were shot trying to cross European borders. Proxy wars between the communist and non-communist side took place all over the world. It was also an era of moral clarity. European and US leaders did not lobby or go to work for communist regimes. If they did, they were charged with treason or espionage. The subsequent post-Cold War era, marked by a so-called peace dividend, meaning a dramatic reduction in defense spending, though only by the liberal democratic countries, resulted in democratization of some countries, though with mixed results. The underlying idea of the post-Cold War era was that it was just communism that was to blame for the ills and nastiness of the Cold War. No doubt a 19th century German's theory of ownership had something to do with it, but the predatory, aggressive imperialism on the part of Russia in Ukraine and elsewhere, unconstrained by any prohibitions on genocide, has nothing to do with Marxism. If anything, it is a throwback to the feudal authoritarianism of 19th century Tsarist Russia, a country Karl Marx thought too primitive and brutal to become communist until the rest of the world was there first. But that era, the post-Cold War era, is now over, though some in Europe and elsewhere harbor illusions that talking to Russia will accomplish something. If many chose to ignore the end of the post-Cold War era after February 24th, it was no longer possible. That was when the last nail was driven into the coffin of the founding principle of the post-World War II international relations, Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter. Article 2, Paragraph 4 provides that a UN member state cannot threaten or use force against the territorial integrity or political independence of another state or in any way that diverges from the purposes of the UN. Many of us have argued that Article 2 was already thrown in the trash bin with Russia's invasions of Georgia in 2008 and Ukraine in 2014, including a full annexation of territory in the latter case. But much of Europe, at least, ignored that. I would argue the United States as well. My point here, however, is that Russia's actions as a member of the so-called P5, the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, and the PRC's refusal to condemn the invasion essentially means that all bets are off. The edifice of international law, the prohibition of aggression to change borders accepted by all members of the UN, has de facto ceased to exist. In international relations and law, we are all in terra nova, new territory, where the most fundamental rules that I would basically say everyone in this room, grew up under. The question then is, where are we when we see the PRC refusing to condemn Russia's action in Ukraine and in Syria, no matter how horrific, in what can only be called an informal or unwritten alliance, proclaiming a, quote, new model of international relations? What they share, in addition to their own authoritarian regimes, in silencing critics, stifling civil society, and violating fundamental rights and freedoms, rule of law and democracy, is a genuine hostility toward liberal democracy. And as many here in Taiwan and throughout the rest of the West fear, a common denial of the prohibition of aggression. Now I'm going to switch gears here and try to bring this into another realm. If I have said that we don't know what geopolitical and historical environment we are in the middle of, the same cannot be said about the technological environment. Indeed, we often define our area by the newest and latest technology that surrounds us. In the 19th century, we had the age of steam and concomitantly the industrial age. We have had the automobile age, the era of flight, the nuclear era, the computer age. All of those were discussed as they were happening. Since the widespread dissemination of digital technology via the smartphone since 2007, where some 4 billion people have gained access to the internet, including social media, we all agree we live in the digital era. Today, virtually all of our industry, our communications, as well as higher level processes such as our political opinions, are mediated via digital technology. While we extol all this as progress, we should not ignore that this has profound effects on security. What I would like to do is look at what the digital era means for the disappearance of the post-World War II international rules in conflict and aggression that I described above. Since the beginning of lethal conflict within the same species, which means since our ancestors, the apes, started killing one another, going back to our pre-hominid ancestors who discovered they could use tools to kill their conspecifics, or same species creatures, the primary unit of war has been force, the definition of which we learned in high school as Newton's second law. Force equals mass times acceleration, where acceleration is the change in velocity over time. In physics, we know this as kinetic force. All use of force from prehistory until the end of the second millennium, that is the year 2000, has exclusively been kinetic. Well, we can leave out a little poison gas here and there and some poisons, but generally it's always been kinetic. You can increase force through a greater mass, a bigger rock, a bigger bomb, or through increased velocity, a better spear-throwing arm, a bow, a trebuchet, or missile. The problem is that roughly since the beginning of this millennium, we have seen the increasing use of digital force. Digital force has no mass, and within the confines of Earth, distance and time are reduced to trivial figures. The implications of this are huge, but not completely negative. It just requires us to think differently. So now a little sort of excursion into the rise of non-kinetic weapons in the 21st century. The nature of war changed dramatically with the development of the computer and its use as a weapon. A profound change that alters the most fundamental assumptions of security and warfare from the previous several million years. This is not to say that kinetic warfare has disappeared, as the brutal invasion of Ukraine shows, yet the use of digital technologies in state-on-state warfare adds a new dimension to security policy that requires us to alter our understanding of aggression, alliances, defense, and responses. And while we have rightly focused on the horrors of Russian war crimes, we should not lose track of how cyber has been used. The invasion of Ukraine was the first case in modern history of a great power with near-peer cyber capability waging a major conventional war. Moscow's cyber operations, all ready to shut down Ukraine's electrical grid in 2015, should have been a warning. Since the war, the expanded war began in February, Russia has sought to disable Ukrainian satellite communications, wipe data from several of its state and Ukraine's state and civic organizations, and of course, peddle disinformation to its public, all of which provide ample data for us to consider. Most importantly, given the power of digital weaponry, we can already assume that any serious state-on-state conflict need not even begin with a kinetic attack, but through creating paralysis in and indeed shutting down the state that is attacked. Electricity grids will be shut down, traffic lights will be turned red or green, water supplies and gas shut off. essentially all unprotected infrastructure can and probably will be shut down in the case of a major conflict. And this probably will occur before any kinetic attack even begins. Any kinetic military infrastructure that is left functional after an initial digital shutdown will be subjected to digital and electronic attacks ranging from electromagnetic pulses, EMPs, that disable all electronics, to the ghosting of GPS on ships and airplanes and guided missiles, as we have already seen with US ships in the Black Sea. Digital systems that survive these attacks will also be targeted. These changes are only beginning to be played out in security policy thinking. All of this in the history of warfare is only as old as the 21st century, and thus has come only recently into our thinking about security policy. It's worth noting that the first panel ever held on cybersecurity at the Munich Security Conference, the premier conference on security in Europe and the US, took place in February of 2011. That's 11 years ago. And of course, doctrine is even slower to come onto the scene. We now have seen hacking, election disruptions, attacks on energy infrastructure, such as the Russian shutdown of the US's colonial oil pipeline, as well as Iran's attack on Saudi Arabia's Aramco, destroying some 30,000 computers. We have seen the Russian worm NotPetya, which inadvertently shut down the world's largest transport company, Maersk. And indeed, if we take Karl von Clausewitz's definition of war, which was the continuation of policy by other means, what we could actually describe as the first war ever using cyber took place in my own country in 2007, so 15 years ago, when we were essentially shut down by Russian DDoS attacks. DDoS stands for Distributed Denial of Service, whereby using massive numbers of bots, digital robots, servers are overwhelmed and cease to function. In our case, our banks and media, as well as government sites, were shut down by Russia in cooperation with Russian mafia hacking groups, which is kind of a common form of public-private partnership in all kinds of realms in the case of Russia. DDoS attacks have become far more massive since 2007, but they are a subset of various forms of disruption, and I won't go into all the various forms of this because, I mean, from hacking to sabotage to what we have seen in the UK Brexit referendum, the US election, the attempt on the French election in 2017, and numerous elections since then are all fairly well chronicled. But the question is, what does this mean for security? Well, first and foremost, this means you no longer need a kinetic war to change policy by other means. Before the digital era, physical possession of territory was, other than buying off the leadership of a country, the war was the only way to win. War, however, is expensive. It is an enormous, potentially ruinous drain on resources. Many of your own population, if you wage war, are killed. GDP plummets, post-war economies are in tatters. And of course, you run the risk, in the case of, say, attacking NATO, of a nuclear war that will destroy your own country. If you win in a conventional, non-nuclear war, you will have to pay forever for the cost of occupation of a hostile, resentful population, as both the Nazi Germany and the USSR discovered. Now, instead of invading a NATO country and risking via Article 5 a war with the forces of NATO, an adversary nation instead can change the government using finances, disinformation, and hacking confidential information to alter a democratic election to elect an anti-NATO, anti-EU party or presidential candidate. We have seen this a number of times since Russia adopted social media disinformation as a tool of political manipulation. I'll skip a bunch here just to keep the time shorter. So the question is, what do we do in this new digital environment and in combination with the end of the post-war era forbidding aggression? As Lenin said, что делать? What is to be done? What is important to realize is that security is no longer just a matter of a strong kinetic military. Yes, that is necessary. You can't fight an invading army with memes, but when adversaries come to rely on different weapons, you do need a greatly expanded notion of what security is. Currently, we face a number of problems in dealing with these threats. The most significant one being a complete lack of understanding among policymakers of the importance of digital threats. True, at least when it comes to hacking, there is now some awareness on the part of militaries and at least some companies. But we face two broad problems in this regard. We lack interdisciplinary, interagency cooperation, and we have national silos that affect feeble international multilateral information sharing. Clearly, when foreign ministries, parliaments, think tanks, candidates in elections, and even the World Anti-Doping Agency are all attacked, as they have been, by one or another of two Russian hacking groups. The CIA calls them APT 28 and 29. They're also called Fancy Bear and Cozy Bear. But if they're attacking all of us, they're attacking the US, there you get the foreign ministry of Denmark, of Norway, of Italy, and the Netherlands, and we don't really do anything, right? And clearly, we don't share information on these things. In part, we can just say, as an aside, that the reason we don't share it all is that is the SIGINT, or signal intelligence, background to this realm of warfare, because it was originally a form of espionage, a realm with a tradition of holding information close to the vest. The sole information-sharing SIGINT group is the Five Eyes Alliance, consisting of the US, UK, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, that includes no other NATO allies, though it has two non-allies, and since Brexit, no EU member states. This does not strike me as a particularly effective way of doing cybersecurity, frankly. However, adversary groups, whether APT 28 or 29, or the infamous troll and that infamous troll and disinformation farm, the Internet Research Agency based in St. Petersburg, Russia, do not base their activities on who belongs to which multilateral group. Borders mean nothing in cyberspace and social media. Indeed, this is, I think, the crucial point, that the truly dramatic change the digital era has brought to security is that geography no longer matters. NATO, after all, is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization not because it represents a unique group of liberal democracies, nor are Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and Taiwan excluded from NATO for a failure to adhere to liberal democracy. NATO was and is an organization not to a small degree based on bomber range, jet fighter refueling capabilities, troop and tank transport, and equipment logistics. That's why it's NATO. With all the considerable planning and infrastructure development through its 7 decades, cyber did not come into planning until only recently, and even there, only to a limited degree. 2 of some 80, count them, 80 NATO centers of excellence, one for cyber issues based in Tallinn and a second to assess disinformation in Riga, are largely hampered by their mandates. They can report on attacks on NATO, the organization, but have limited authority to assess and report attacks on individual member states, essentially limiting already limited defense with proscriptions. Neither has any operational authority. I do understand that cooperation has improved since a little more than a decade ago when Estonia, that is my country, reported to NATO that we had found a Russian worm in our military network, and the response was, "Oh, you too." Now, for an organization that requires strong common standards and interoperability of weapon systems, the attention paid to cyber and disinformation attack is, to be polite, woefully weak. In the European Union, a focus on PESCO, which stands for Permanent Structured Cooperation, as a kind of parallel NATO structure, doesn't quite fit the bill either. And we do have ENISA, the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity, that was created to deal with these issues, but it simply does not carry the heft and weight to be able to respond to cyber. Similarly, Wolfgang Ischinger, chairman of the West Premier Security Forum, the Munich Security Conference, just recently lamented the complete lack of security dimension in EU legislation, so that the new EU competition regulations do not take into account at all cybersecurity issues, as if all platforms and devices are playing on a level playing field, which shows how little the EU's policies have been concerned with the new threats of the digital era and what they pose to privacy and security. Today, neither of the West's premier international institutions has come to grips with the complete transformation of the security environment, where Tallinn, Toronto, Torino, Topeka, Taipei, and Tokyo, I couldn't find a T-town for Australia or New Zealand, but are spatially and temporally equidistant in a potential attack from an adversary. In other words, there is no more geography. It's not tank logistics. You want to attack my capital, Tallinn, or you want to attack Taipei, it's a microsecond difference from when the attack arrives. So we need to think outside of geography when we think about security. So in fact, one major economic and political democracy, skip that. So where we are is that we live in a new era, and our security arrangements and our political arrangements, and especially our geopolitical arrangements, have not caught up with where we are. Any serious approach to security of liberal democracies, moreover, will have to go beyond current institutional limitations. Why in the digital era would we leave out, in the case of NATO, why would we leave out Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, Australia, and a country that produces more than half of the world's computer chips, Taiwan? Why? Moreover, why stop there? If you want liberal democracies to be secure in the digital era, why not include other liberal democracies? Switzerland, Israel, Uruguay, Chile, and Costa Rica, all digitally advanced nations, all of which are vulnerable as we are. I would go much further. The world is rapidly falling into a division between authoritarian and liberal democratic blocs. And this also in the entire realm of cyber. Yet among the liberal democratic, in the liberal democratic bloc, in the digital age, we observe only greater splintering. We see the European Union concentrating not on digital security from authoritarian attacks, but instead focusing on landmark legislation and policies that are better understood as merely anti-American. This is not to say safeguarding EU citizens' privacy from US surveillance capitalism-based social media companies is bad, but we do need to think about security. And we have seen, in fact, what an American social media company do with the Cambridge Analytica scandal, whereby psychological profiles of some 80 million Americans were gleaned by a company called Cambridge Analytica that then provided those details most likely to the Russian security apparatus. Today, however, when NATO is strictly defined geographically, the European Commission's primary mission instead seems to be reigning in GAFA, Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon, and where the Five Eyes do not even talk to Europe, and a number of critical potential allies are not on our radar screens at all, especially in Asia, as I mentioned, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, and of course, New Zealand and Australia. We need to rethink what security means in the digital era. We do, however, see an emerging confluence of values where even in the digital era, authoritarians self-define themselves, as do liberal democracies. At the UNGE, the UN group of governmental experts convened to set out minimal rules for cyber attacks and cybersecurity. 2 rounds have produced no results, primarily because of Russian and Chinese, as well as, I think, Iranian insistence on UN regulation of content in the digital world, meaning free speech. And so a priori, or even in the digital era, we are forced into 2 camps, the liberal democratic camp that believes in free speech and the authoritarian camp that does not, and which also, incidentally, doesn't want to follow the kinds of rules that we take for ourselves. All of this leads me to argue that we need a digital alliance like NATO, but one that is really truly value-based, includes all liberal democracies that wish to be a part of it, and is not bound by geography, but those shared values, since after all, the threats faced by liberal democracies no longer are geographically bound. Technology changes conflict, and changes war, and so too, obviously, our security. From weapons of stone to bronze to iron, technological developments give an advantage to those who have them. Stirrups and gunpowder, too, change the nature of conflict. The first made cavalry far more versatile, and the second rendered medieval castles useless. Today, the West as a whole, meaning all of us here, continues to build, or at least plans to build, castles that are more in the air than grounded in reality, while our adversaries are busy producing ever better gunpowder. Thank you.
Thanks to His Excellency, Mr. President Toomas Hendrik Ilves, for your wonderful speech.